All right. Hello. Welcome to Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, our last one before Lent, and our last one where we will finally, God willing, complete our study of the Pentateuch. Is the goal for this evening is to move through the rest of Deuteronomy well and also expeditiously, knowing that following this week, next Monday, we will be in our Lenten book study. And for our Lenten book study, we are studying a book called The Prince of Darkness. Woo! The evolution of our understanding of evil and the nature of good by Jeffrey Burton Russell. I would encourage you to be a part of it. It's going to be a very interesting and enlightening study. No pun intended. Yeah. No extra charge for that kind of humor. But before we dive in, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. We give thanks to you, O Lord our God, for all your servants and witnesses of time past, for Abraham, the father of believers, and Sarah, his wife, for Moses, the lawgiver, and Aaron, the priest, for Miriam and Joshua, Deborah and Gideon, and Samuel with Hannah, his mother, for Isaiah and all the prophets, for Mary, the mother of our Lord, for Peter and Paul and all the apostles, for Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene, for Stephen, the first martyr, and all the martyrs and saints in every age and in every land. In your mercy, O Lord our God, give us as you gave them the hope of salvation and the promise of eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord, the firstborn of many from the dead. Amen.
Amen.
I've used that prayer before in this class, but I just like it. And since this is the end of our story of Moses, I thought it'd be appropriate to remember him in the prayer. So as we close out on Deuteronomy, still the three texts we're using. I didn't use Brit Olam as much in this last one because it was kind of getting into the weeds a bit more than I wanted to. So I actually wound up using the study notes in the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible more than Brit Olam to guide me in this evening's course, just so you're aware of that. So review. There's genocide in the Bible. It's very unsettling. Do you all remember some of the things we talked about how we handle and think through these questions? So maybe these are primitive expressions of Israel's God, but much of the violence is actually later in their history. That doesn't help. Some approaches have a kind of anti-Semitic, well, those are just backwards Jewish people. That's not helpful. So rather what we do is we want to look at those joints and tensions in the text, the fact that there are pronouncements of complete destruction set alongside of acknowledgement that indigenous people remain. The rhetoric may be hyperbolic. It seems to be stressing the importance of distance from the land. It's about an unadulterated commitment to God. It's a thorny question, one that we can't resolve, but one that the text itself doesn't seem to resolve perfectly. And then we began with the second address of Moses in the next part, talking about some of the things that he did, some of the key points from that second address. It claims to be a retelling of Exodus 19 through 20, but there are significant changes in theology and detail. Whereas in Exodus, it's a mixed group of the Israelites and other people who came up with them. It is just the Israelites in Deuteronomy. Because remember, Deuteronomy is very much about that separation of the Israelites, the people of God, from the other. Obedience in the Deuteronomic understanding of this covenant is about active respect for the integrity of the neighbor, particularly the orphan, the alien, and the widow. Yeah, that's kind of where we were to kind of catch you up. I'm thank you for your patience as I missed last week, trying to get my body back up and running after my vaccine. But this week, we're going to cover the rest of the second address, then do a bit of stuff on the third address, and then talk about the ending of the book of Deuteronomy. So let's dive in. Any questions before I dive in? No, excellent. Okay. So Deuteronomy chapter 12 is where we're going to begin. And what you've got here in this picture is a picture of a bama in Hebrew, or bamot, if you do that in plural, which is a high place. And the idea being that in ancient Israel, high places on top of hills were cultic sites that were originally, there were several there were high places all over Israel where Yahweh was worshipped. But a significant concern of Deuteronomy is they believe these high places had a tendency towards syncretism, towards not just being about the worship of Yahweh, but also the worship of other Canaanite gods. And so they want to get rid of all the high places in Deuteronomy and centralize all worship only in Jerusalem. And so that begins really in earnest in Deuteronomy 12. Oops. I just turned my computer to sleep. Stop it. All right, so let me turn to Deuteronomy 12 in my Bible, and we'll read those first 7 verses together. All right. These are the statutes and ordinances that you must diligently observe in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to occupy all the days of the earth. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispossess serve their gods, on the mountain heights, on the hills, and under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, and hew down the idols of their gods, and thus blot out their names from their places. You shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways, but you shall seek out the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes as his habitation, to put his name there. And you shall go there, bringing there your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and your donations, your votive gifts, your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herd and flocks. And you shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your households together, rejoicing in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. So, interesting thing, just in those 7 verses right there, the Hebrew for that word you alternates between singular you and plural y'all, or if you're in the Midwest, you guys, however you want to handle that. Going back, and so what that indicates, that lack of consistency in the grammar, generally that would say that this is a couple of different texts that have been kind of smushed together. So that indicates that there's probably a few different ancient texts being pushed together to create this one that have different histories in them. So that's just something to note. This is not what, as we've said before, this is not something someone wrote down that Moses said on the plains of Moab, but this is several ancient texts over time being edited into a new form during the time of the exile. Also, this is clearly not what the original command by God was. So, for example, if you can turn to 1 Kings chapter 3, you'll see an example of how this initially shook out. So 1 Kings 3, this is when Solomon prays for wisdom after he made the temple. So this is long after the conquest. And I'll start with verse 1. Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. So this is hundreds of years after the time of the conquest, at the time of Solomon, because remember, it was Solomon who built the temple in Jerusalem. There wasn't even a temple in Jerusalem in the time of David. So it's saying that before there was a temple in Jerusalem, everyone sacrificed at high places. So this idea that in Deuteronomy that God said, no high places, get rid of them, you'll only ever worship it, like that's very anachronistic to how the worship of Israel actually developed. And what's fascinating is you get that in First Kings, which is acknowledging what happened, and then you get that reinterpreted in Second Kings chapter 16. If you have got a Bible and you want to flip there, Second Kings 16, where in verse 4 you read, so this is talking about Ahaz and how he fell. Ahaz sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. So what this is saying that the problem is that the people after the temple was built, these kings went back to the high places. So it's starting to get that suspicion that maybe the high places were a bad idea. That eventually, by the time of the exile, develops into, oh, God had told us never to worship at these high places, which we know is historically inaccurate given the rest of the biblical text. This is a really important point in Deuteronomy and for understanding the development of the religion of the people of Israel. That these prohibitions against the high places were later developments that were later read back upon their history. But that when you read this in Deuteronomy, this was not the command initially, because clearly the people worshiped the high places, and it was not, that's where you went to worship God, to worship Yahweh. It's a big point, but it's kind of confusing if you've never been told it before. Does that make sense? Questions, comments? Great, you all are right up there with me. So continuing in verse 8 of Deuteronomy 12.
I've got a question real quickly.
Yeah, go for it, Barbara.
Um, why would God tell them not to worship in the high places if he knew that that's basically all they had?
Yeah, and that's precisely the point. You know, the problem with reading Deuteronomy with kind of a literalistic understanding is so God's gonna, so where are they gonna worship God? Because what it says in Deuteronomy is that you'll worship in the place where my name will be. Well, yeah, but what are they supposed to do until then? It's going to be hundreds of years before they before David conquers Jerusalem and builds a temple there. So yeah, it doesn't. If you read Deuteronomy as being kind of what Moses actually said, it makes no sense. But if you read Deuteronomy as being the way that the law of Moses was recast and re-understood in the time of Josiah following the exile, where they're re-understanding their religion and how they should have done it all along, then you get to see some of how this makes sense. And we'll see this in other parts of the text that we're going to go through tonight. But that's absolutely, Barbara, that is the key like problem with a fundamentalist reading of Deuteronomy. Nancy Collins, your alarm went off.
My clock chimed.
That's good. So beginning in verse 8 of chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, this is Moses still speaking. You shall not act as we are acting here today, all of us according to our own desires, for you have not yet come into the rest in the possession that the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross over the Jordan and live in the land that the Lord your God is allotting you, and when he gives you rest from your enemies all around so that you live in safety, then you shall bring everything I command you to the place that the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and donations, and all your choice votive gifts that you vowed to the Lord. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you together with your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, and the Levites who reside in your town, since they have no allotment or inheritance with you. So this is that centralizing worship beginning to take place. So the rest won't happen, Deuteronomy is saying, until the territory has been secured. And you can see that develop in later parts of the Hebrew Bible. So for example, in Joshua 21, if you want to flip there, if you've got a Bible handy, Joshua 21 and verse 44, we read, so this is after all of the conquest is finally done in Joshua. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. So this is Joshua saying that that rest that was promised finally took place after the conquest. And then that gets further developed later in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where we read in verse 11, this is God speaking to God's covenant with David. I'll begin in verse 10. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. Evildoers shall afflict them no more. This is that rest once more. From the time I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house, and when your days are fulfilled, you will lie down with your ancestors. So this is God promising that he's going to make a house for David, but also, as we find in this text from 2 Samuel 7, it is God's promise that because what David says, I'm going to build a house for you. And God was like, you're going to make me a house? No, David, I will make you a house. But then it will be David's son, Solomon, as we heard, who winds up being the one who actually builds the temple. So the idea being that the reason Deuteronomy gives, kind of to answer Barbara's question about, so why isn't there a centralized worship place at the very beginning? Because the first task the people had was to secure the land. And it just took them hundreds and hundreds of years to do it. Before they secured the land and had rested, then the temple could be constructed. Now, where were they supposed to worship it until that happened? Deuteronomy doesn't seem to have an answer to that question. But that's the reason Deuteronomy gives for kind of the reality that we know historically. The Levites were not allotted land. That's noted as well in this text. Remember that the allotment was given to the various tribes, but not to the Levites. So the Levites survive on voluntary offerings. That's fundamental to what's going on here, and I'll deal more with that in just a second here. So then it continues just to describe proper sacrifice in verse 13 of Deuteronomy 12. So go back to that. Deuteronomy 12. Oops. Deuteronomy 12. Beginning in verse 13. Take care that you do not offer your burnt offerings at any place you happen to see, but only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do everything I command you. Yet whenever you desire, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns, according to the blessing that the Lord your God has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as they would of gazelle or deer. The blood, however, they must not eat. You shall pour it out on the ground like water. Nor may you eat within your towns the tithe of your grain, your wine, or your oil, the firstlings of your herd or your flocks, or any of your votive gifts that you vow, your freewill offerings, your donations. These you shall eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God will choose, together with your son and your daughter, your male and female slave, and the Levite resident in your towns, rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God in all your undertakings. Take care that you do not neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land. When the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he has promised you, and you say, I'm going to eat some meat because you wish to eat meat, you may eat me wherever you desire. If the place where the Lord your God has chosen to put his name is too far from you, and you slaughter as I have commanded you any of your herd or flock that the Lord has given you, then you may eat it within your towns whenever you desire. Indeed, just as a gazelle or deer is eaten, so you may eat it. The unclean and the clean alike may eat it. Only be sure you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life, and you shall not eat the life with the meat. Do not eat it, you shall pour it out on the ground like water. Do not eat it so that it may go well with you and your children after you, because you do what is right in the sight of the Lord. But the sacred donations that are due from you and your votive gifts you shall bring to the place the Lord will choose. You shall present your burnt offerings, both the meat and the blood, on the altar of the Lord your God, and the blood of your other sacrifices shall be poured out beside the altar of the Lord your God, but the meat you may eat. So you're probably thinking, this is some pretty obscure ritual law going on here. So what it's doing here is actually making a pretty significant shift in the way that meat is consumed in Israel. So once more, contrary to what had prior been the practice, now all worship will happen at a single sanctuary. But there are some issues that creates. First off, the Levites, the priestly tribe, had served at those local shrines. The sacrifices and the offerings that happened there was how they made their living. So you're going to put all of these local parish priests out of business and tell everyone they have to go to the national cathedral for worship. So what do you do? And so that's why it's saying that you still need to be sure that you take care of the Levite. So you've taken the church from your parish priest, but you still have to be sure you take care of him so he doesn't go poor and hungry, which is kind of a stupid system, if you ask me. Also, all slaughter used to be sacrificial. This is a huge thing people don't realize. In ancient Israel, anytime you killed an animal, it was a sacrificial offering. You would go to the local shrine, you would slaughter the animal with the priest, you would offer up a blessing to God, and then they would butcher the animal and you would take the animal home and eat it. That's how slaughter happened. But if the only place to offer sacrifice in Jerusalem, what do you do if you live 200 miles from Jerusalem? You can't go there every time you slaughter. So Deuteronomy is saying, this is a change, that when you just need to kill something to eat it, you can, you live too far from Jerusalem to kill it there, you can kill it at your home. It's fine. Don't drink the blood. Don't eat the blood. We don't do that. That's weird. But you can slaughter at home and that's fine. So it no longer is all slaughter sacrificial, which is actually a very interesting shift if you think about it, because it used to be that the taking the life of an animal was a significant religious act. And now it's simply something you do to get food. So this makes the vegetarians in the crowd, I don't know if it makes them happier or sadder, the way that shifted in ancient Israel. But it is a shift that took place in the time of Deuteronomy. That's a kind of a huge thing that a lot of people don't realize. Questions, thoughts?
So when you think of these texts in light of the Eucharist, I mean, is there a connection? Is there not a connection?
Oh, I would say there very much is a connection. So if you think of, the Eucharist as being, of course, this is ours. So in the Eucharist, we believe Christ is the final sacrifice, was sacrificed once forever on the cross. And what we do in the Eucharist, and this is actually, this is straight Eucharistic theology. So what we do in the Eucharist is we go ahead and we bring our best offerings from our homes, our money, whatever that might be. We bring it along with bread and wine as a symbol of that. We bring that to church. We carry it to the altar, just like the ancient Israelites would have when they went to their local shrine. We offer it up to God, and our offering is joined to the sacrifice of Christ that happened 2,000 years ago on the cross and is given back to us then as flesh and blood, just like it was for the ancient Israelites. Only we believe that flesh and blood is found in the Eucharistic bread and in the Eucharistic chalice. So yeah, so what you see is it's in the same way that there was a development that happened between local sacrifice and slaughter and then the centralization of worship. What you see happening here is a similar development of how we understand sacrifice, and it also connects to something in terms of history. So in the ancient church, in the first few centuries, there was the presbyter or the bishop. They were kind of interchangeable, the priest and the bishop. But what happened is, as the church grew, there would be kind of the senior priest, and then like the other priests who served under that senior, and that senior priest began to be known as the episcopos, the overseer. And the question was, so the bishop can't be in every local community because there's not enough bishops and there's too many local communities. So we're going to have the priest celebrate mass when the bishop can't be there. And that's where my authority derives from the authority of the bishop. I exist under orders from the bishop because the bishop is the chief pastor and priest of the diocese. So it's the same sort of thing. But what we did in Christianity is, rather than centralized worship, that you can only get communion if you come to the cathedral and get it from the bishop. We authorized explicitly the Levites, or the local parish clergy, community clergy, to offer that sacrifice of Eucharist in a local locale, so you don't have to come to the bishop. But there's still debate, that happens. You see, one of the questions is the role of confirmation. In the early church, you were just confirmed when you were baptized. But when you started not seeing your bishop as often, the bishops start saying that they should be the only ones that should be able to do confirmation, which was not normal. And so there's debate in England in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, because the English priests were confirming people when they baptized them. And the Roman custom was to reserve that to the bishop. And there was this big fight about it, where Rome made the English priests stop because you've got to wait till the bishop comes. But the problem was the bishop wasn't coming to some of these cities for years, and people didn't want to wait. So this question between centralization of worship and authority, it keeps coming up in different ways throughout the Bible and throughout Christian history. Weird stuff, right?
It repeats itself.
It does. Oh yeah, we think we've solved it, and it just will crop up in a new way. Other thing to know is that reality that blood is the symbol of life. And that's one of the reasons why it's rejected that we don't consume it. There's also some cultic practices in the Canaanite world, and there are practices in Mesoamerica about consuming blood for consuming life, right? So there's some religious things that you're avoiding there. But that's also a deep symbol, even from early, if you remember, when Cain kills his brother Abel, what God says is, the blood of your brothers calling out to me from the ground. So that blood is indeed the embodiment of life, and is treated as very sacred in Israelite and Jewish thought. So let's press on in chapter 12 to verse 28. I already read 28, so we'll start with 29. When the Lord your God has cut off from before you the nations whom you are about to enter to dispossess them, when you have dispossessed them and live in your land, take care that you are not ensnared into imitating them after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire concerning their gods, saying, how did these nations worship their gods. I also want to do the same. You must not do the same for the Lord your God, because every abhorrent thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods. They would even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. You must diligently observe everything that I command you. Do not add to it or take anything from it. So their obedience will ensure the continued nature of the promise, which is explaining why at the time this was written, the promise was lost, why it was they lost the land. It's because they hadn't been disobedient as God had commanded them. Also here, one of the reasons given for the dispossessing of the Canaanites is that they were practicing child sacrifice. There are two key significant religious rituals that Canaanites are accused of and that are rejected by Israel. Number one is the practice of child sacrifice, elsewhere said to be sacrificed to the Canaanite deity of Moloch. The other is temple prostitution, where you'd go to the high place and you'd lie with a temple prostitute, and that would give you some religious experience. And those are both fundamentally rejected by Israel. And yet, notice, if you remember the story of Samuel and his sons, what his sons did, the priests, the sons of Samuel, not Samuel, it's Eli and his son, when Samuel was going up in the temple, is Eli's sons were sleeping with the women who served in the temple. So not only was that a violation of sacred trust as a priest to the people serving, but it was like the practice of the Canaanites. This idea that the women serving in the temple are the sexual property of the priests or of the worshipers. So when the sons of Eli are and all of Eli's house is destroyed from the priestly line, part of that is hearkening back that we don't worship the way the Canaanite people worship. So that's being kind of very explicitly rejected here.
But what about Abraham and Isaac?
Yes, so that's one of the questions. So is the story, and generally, what if you remember back when we did the story of Abraham and Isaac, one of the ideas is in that story, what's happening is God is drawing a distinction, because when Abraham does raise his hand to sacrifice Isaac, as Canaanite people would have done, God stops Abraham's hand and says no. And then the Lord provides a ram, and that is God's final and decisive word that sacrificing your children to a deity will not be a part of the Abrahamic covenant. So I tend to fall into that line of thinking that the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is written specifically to condemn child sacrifice. And it is the moment when God showed Abraham that this is not how he will worship God, because then never again does that take place with God. It only ever takes place with terms of failed kings. The other thing you see at the end of chapter 12 is this commitment to preserve the law unchanged. Don't add anything to it, don't take anything away, which of course is ironic, right? Because all of Deuteronomy is adding things to the law and taking things away from the law, but I guess we're just going to ignore that. But that idea of don't add to it, don't take away from it, that's very common in ancient Near Eastern treaties. A lot of times when you'd read these suzerain treaties between a more powerful state and a vassal state, the treaty will end with a commitment that neither party will add to or take away from it. So that's being put in Deuteronomy, not because don't know Deuteronomy is changing the law, but it's being put in Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy is trying to be written as that kind of covenantal relationship between the people of Israel and God, as opposed to the people of Israel and their vassal. So that's why it's using the ancient Near Eastern treaty language that is very familiar to that time. Questions, thoughts before we move out of this idea of centralizing worship and shifting the nature of sacrifice and slaughter? That's kind of one of the big changes of Deuteronomy that I just wanted to be sure we're all kind of aware of. That's kind of how Deuteronomy. Another thing to note is throughout that text of chapter 12, it's not just the people who come to worship, right? You should bring your slave, bring the resident alley. Everyone gets to be a part of the worship of God in Deuteronomy. That's a constant concern, is that this isn't just something for the powerful, but that everyone gets to enjoy the benefits of the ritual system. So let's talk about Deuteronomy 16. So Deuteronomy 16 kind of lays out in Deuteronomic terms the three great pilgrimage festivals that existed in ancient Israel. These are the festivals when you would go to your local sanctuary or shrine for worship, But now in Deuteronomy, in all of these festivals, you go to Jerusalem once a year for these festivals. Just out of curiosity, because I've preached on this before, can anyone name the 3 pilgrimage festivals? One of them's already on the screen, so that's cheating. If but you can take that one out. Passover. But does anyone know the other 2?
Festival of Weeks and the Festival of Booths.
Nice. Festival of Weeks. And he was not reading that from the text. That was straight out of memory. So we'll start with the Feast of the Passover, which is in chapter 16, beginning in verse 1. Observe the month of Aviv by keeping the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Aviv, the Lord your God brought you out of the land of Egypt by night. You shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd, at the place that the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. You must not eat it with anything leavened. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, because you came out of the land of Egypt in great haste, so that all of the days of your life you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt. No leaven shall be seen within all your territory for 7 days, and none of the meat of what you slaughter on the evening of the first day shall remain until morning. You are not permitted to offer the Passover sacrifice within any of your towns that the Lord your God has given you. This is a change, but only at the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. Only there shall you offer the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sunset, the time of the day when you departed from Egypt. You shall cook it and eat it at the place that the Lord your God will choose, and the next morning you may go back to your tents. For 6 days you shall continue to eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a solemn assembly for the Lord your God, when you shall do no work. Lots of things going on, changing here. First off, Passover originally, remember, was a family observance. We read this in Exodus 12, that you did this in your home. If your house couldn't eat a whole lamb, you'd join with the household next to you, and you'd sacrifice the lamb, you'd roast it together, and you would mark the doorway to remind you of that flight from Egypt. That was the way it was always practiced. In Deuteronomy, that's fundamentally changed. Now the slaughter must only ever take place at Jerusalem. Huge difference. Also, there's actually 2 festivals getting confused here. There's the festival of Passover and the festival of unleavened bread, which was also celebrated early in the spring. And if you compare this to Leviticus 23 or Numbers 28, and I won't read those there, but in both of those texts, they're separate festivals. There's the festival of the Passover, and then the day after that, there's the festival of unleavened bread for the following week. That's the way it's in both Leviticus 23 and Numbers 28. What's fascinating is here in Deuteronomy, they're saying it's the same festival. So the festival of unleavened bread and the festival of Passover have been conflated into just one festival. Interestingly as well, in Exodus, it has to be an animal from the flock. But this, in Deuteronomy, it says from the flock or the herd. So it's shifting the animals that are allowed. Secondly, Exodus is clear that it has to be roasted. It even says it may not be boiled. What's fascinating is in our text in verse 7, it said, you shall cook it and eat it at the place the Lord your God will choose. The Hebrew there is literally translated is boiled, which is what you would normally do with sacrifices. If you remember the shrine at Shiloh, what you would do is you boil the meat and the priest sticks in a tong and pulls out something. Whatever he pulls out is what he has to eat. So what's fascinating is that there's 2 they're disagreeing with each other about, can it just be the flock and the herbs? Now there's boiling. And what's amazing is that those 2 varying traditions are harmonized later in 2 Chronicles chapter 35. So if you flip there, you'll see how this contradiction is resolved down in verse 13. And this, of course, remember, 2 Chronicles is the story of Josiah and Josiah's reforms. So what it says is, in verse 13, they roasted the Passover lamb with fire according to the ordinance, and they boiled the holy offerings in pots, in cauldrons, and in pans, and carried them all to the. So it's saying that we roast the Passover lamb. The other offerings we boil. So they're trying to find ways of taking the fact that there are two contrasting traditions that have grown up over time and how do we blend them together now so we know what the right way is, which is just, it's how you can tell that there's a history to this text. There's some developments that are taking place. Questions about the Feast of Passover? It's weird. Next is the Feast of Weeks, also as known as the Feast of Shavuot. And we read about this beginning in verse 9. All right. You shall count 7 weeks. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God, contributing a freewill offering in proportion to the blessing you receive from the Lord your God. Rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, the Levites resident in your towns, as well as the strangers, the orphans, and the widows who are among you, at the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt and diligently observed these statutes. So Shavuot was originally a harvest festival in June, when you would harvest the grain. The grain harvest was a season of gladness. You start with the harvest of barley, which takes place on the time of Passover, and then the harvest of grain, of wheat, that happens at Shavuot. And what you would do traditionally is you would offer 2 loaves of bread in the temple from the Shavuot wheat, from the wheat that you harvest on this day. That's the tradition behind this ritual. Interesting, after the Bible in post-biblical Judaism, the Feast of Weeks became associated with the revelation on Sinai. And in the New Testament, it becomes renamed as Pentecost because it's the 50th day after Passover. So the Hellenistic Jews that spoke Greek called the Feast of Weeks Pentecostes, which is 50 because it's 50 days later. On Passover, the people of Israel were freed from Pharaoh. And on Shavuot, when Mount Sinai and the revelation of the law happened, they were given the Torah and became a nation committed to God. That's not present in the Deuteronomy text, but that's because the Deuteronomy text just represents one stage of development of these religious feasts. They continue to develop and change as the people grow and change. And once again, notice women, slaved, marginalized, disadvantaged, immigrant, all of them participate in the festival. Why? Because you were once slaves in the land of Egypt. That's such a fundamental concern. In Deuteronomy, we're trying to centralize worship. We're getting rid of the other nations and all of that. But there's alongside of that this deep concern for the woman, the slave, the marginalized, the disadvantaged, and the immigrant. That's showing up over and over again. So that's Shavuot. Questions on Shavuot? Then the third is the festival of booths, or Sukkot, which we get in verse 13, beginning in verse 13. You shall keep the festival of booths for 7 days. When you've gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and your wine press, rejoice during your festival, you and your sons and your daughters, your male and female slaves, as well as the Levites, the strangers, and the orphans and widows resident in your towns. For 7 days you shall keep the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord your God will choose. For the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all your undertakings, and you shall surely celebrate. I'm going all the way to the end of this. So 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, at the festival of unleavened bread, at the festival of weeks, and at the festival of booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. All shall give as they are able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God that he has given you. So Sukkot, the festival of booths, often sometimes called the festival of tabernacles, was originally, this was the fall harvest. So you had the spring and summer festival. This is the fall harvest festival. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, it's simply called the ingathering, which is, what we get our pledging gathering from. It's similar originally to other Canaanite fall harvest festivals. There's also another festival very similar to this described in Numbers 29 in the priestly tradition called the Festival of the Dwellings of Branches, which, if you think about it, if this is about making temporary structures that you live in, well, dwellings of branches is one way of doing that, right? The booths, it's very, people debate, but where did this weird festival come from? Some people think that these may have been booths that were shelters the agricultural workers had to build in the fields because you had to work so hard to process the harvest in time, and so that's where it comes from. Others would say that this the tabernacles, the tents, were the shelters the worshipers would stay in when they came to Jerusalem after they left the temple. They'd stay in these tents. We don't really know. It's largely speculation. Interestingly enough, though, in Orthodoxy, the Feast of the Transfiguration is connected to the Feast of the Booths. Can anyone guess why? What does Peter say when he sees Jesus and Moses and Elijah?
Let's build.
Build a booth.
Right, let's build three. And so some people think that means that actually that happened during the Feast of Booths. Others think that's just he's doing what he knows to do from that festival. But there is that interesting connection between the Feast of Transfiguration, which in our calendar happens in August, and the Feast of Sukkot. Also note, at the end, these three festivals that happen, first over, Passover is fully subsumed into unleavened bread. When it names the festivals, it doesn't even name Passover. Unleavened bread, weeks, and booths. Passover and unleavened bread are the same thing. Also note, it says 3 times a year, all your mouths shall appear, which is contrary to the instructions given above, right? So once again, this is textual history. Probably the older tradition was the men had to go, and then eventually this developed into the entire household going. So you're seeing the textual history kind of bending is these joints and these hinges that exist. Questions on Sukkot? So we're going to jump now ahead even farther to chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, where we're in now the second address. The third address of Moses. We're going to do verses 1 through 9. So these are the words of the covenant. This is after the first address and second address are done. These are the words of the covenant that the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites in the land of Moab, in addition to the covenant he had made with them at Horeb. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a mind to understand it, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. I have led you for 40 years in the wilderness. The clothes on your back have not worn out, and the sandals on your feet have not worn out. You have not eaten bread, and you have not drunk wine or strong drink, so that you may know that I am the Lord your God. But when you came to this place, King Sihon of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan came out against us in battle, but we defeated them. We took their land and gave it as an inheritance to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Therefore, diligently observe the words of this covenant, in order that you may succeed in everything that you do." So what's happening here is the covenant's been retold, and now Israel is being formally adjured to enter into the covenant, to swear to obey the laws of chapter 12 through 26 under the penalties warned about in chapter 28. Also note that the covenant is now a unified whole. Earlier in Deuteronomy, it would talk about the laws and then the statutes and ordinances. The laws we heard about in chapter 4, the statutes and ordinances in chapter 12. But now the whole of them is simply the covenant. It's one solid piece. Also note that before, the wilderness wandering was punishment for their failure. But here in chapter 29, it said the purpose of the wandering was to teach them how to know God, which is an interesting reinterpretation of the point of the wilderness wandering. So that's the commitment, the covenant is being sworn to once more. And then we get the kind of the ending of the book of Deuteronomy, beginning in chapter 32. So let me flip there real quick. Deuteronomy 33 through 34. There we go. All right. So, I went too far. Begin chapter 32. Deuteronomy 32 through 33. There we go. That's better. So beginning in verse 44, we hear, so there's this song that Moses sang, and then Moses came and recited all the words of the song in the hearing of people, he and Joshua, son of Nun. When Moses had finished reciting all of these words to Israel, yeah, I want to make sure I'm not reading too far. Yeah, I read it all. Okay. When Moses finished reciting all of these words to Israel, he said to them, take to heart all the words I'm giving in witness against you today. Give them as a command to your children, so that they may diligently observe all the words of this law. This is no trifling matter for you, but rather your very life. Through it you may live long in the land that you are crossing over the Jordan to possess. And on that day, that very day, the Lord addressed Moses as follows. Ascend this mountain of Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab across from Jericho, in view of the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites for a possession. You shall die there on the mountain that you ascend, and you shall be gathered to your kin, as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his kin. Because both of you broke faith with me among the Israelites at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin, by failing to maintain my holiness among the Israelites. Although you may view the land from a distance, you shall not enter it, the land that I am giving to the Israelites. And then this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the Israelites before his death. And then there's the blessing. I won't get to that. So what's going on is likely there are two separate conclusions, two separate ways Deuteronomy originally ended, or these original texts ended. And the editors of Deuteronomy take both of these endings and they kind of smush them together in this story. The announcement, as we hear, of Moses' death from Numbers 27 is repeated and is joined to the narrative of the death of Moses that we hear in chapter 34 in just a little bit here. When he says, you shall die, what he's actually saying to Moses is die. It's the imperative. He's telling him to die. He's commanding him to die, which is kind of violent. In Moses, but the point is that Moses lives and dies at the command of God. Moses then blesses the Israelites in chapter 32, verses 2, just the way a father would bless his children, naming each of the tribes and blessing them as though they were his children. And then he dies in chapter 34. So let me go to that real quick. Deuteronomy, 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I've let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired, and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. And Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen in Israel like a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants in his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. So where this happens is unsure. The text is joining two different traditions. In the priestly tradition, this happens at Mount Nebo, which is in the Transjordan, east of Jericho. But it also says in Deuteronomy this happens at Mount Pisgah, but Mount Pisgah is actually slightly to the west and is only ever described in the Deuteronomic tradition. So probably there are two traditions about what mountain Moses was on when he died. Once again, he died at the Lord's command, not of an old age, not of infirmity. God said, die, and he died. Literally, the text in Hebrew is not he was buried, but he buried him. We talked about this before. This is a similar thing we saw back in Numbers. So that the sense being that God buried him. So Moses' children normally would have come and would have, prepared him for burial and burial him, but God himself is the one who buries Moses. His burial site is unknown, so there can't be a shrine there. And the only bequest, what he leaves behind, is not a shrine or a burial place, but is the Torah, the law, the covenant that he's given in Deuteronomy. And Moses' authority is now given to Joshua through the laying on of hands. And that's the end. That's the end of Deuteronomy. All right, questions, conversations. My battery is close to dying, and we're at the end of our time, but I've got 8% left and a couple minutes left to chit chat. So, questions, comments, as we conclude? Duke?
One thing that cropped up in my, just as I was reading through this, is I can see if you, I mean, I compare this to modern day, where you have people that are thinking it's okay to like strap a bomb to themselves and go and blow up a bunch of people. That if you take, and they're saying that this is part, you know, in part of their religion, that if you take some of this out of context, or depending on how you interpret it, you could think that that is coming from some of these texts.
Yeah, well, and it's and you're absolutely right, and this is very much how Zionist Christianity thinks about all of this. And some of the violence behind Zionist Christianity and also Zionist Judaism, they're basing it on this. This is the reason why they drove out the Palestinians. This is the reason why there is apartheid in the Holy Land. All of these things are because God has given us this land. And that's and it's important because on one side, I want to resist some of that because that seems what God had done thousands of years ago. It seems really not to be applied now. But at the same time, I don't want to be anti-Semitic because some of these texts have been rejected in ways that get really close to anti-Semitism. And so it's this very difficult thing. How do we read these texts today, given the violence that they have engendered and the violence they still engender? And yeah, there's not a real good answer to that one. That was helpful. Other comments, questions, thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I guess you shouldn't be apologizing too much. Maybe, I mean, there's the fundamentalist way of interpreting it, and then the non-fundamentalist way. And and I wouldn't say it's anti-Semitic. It's just how you see the world, your worldview.
And it's for someone outside of Judaism to draw some of the same conclusions that some people, Orthodox Jews, do is doesn't coming from someone else, because there's some traditions of very Orthodox Judaism that were opposed to establishing the state of Israel, because that was for God to do, and for people to take into their own hands recreating the state was blasphemous.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Carol.
Say that.
And similarly, there's a lot of skepticism to Zionist Christianity that's kind of using Israel for its own ends, in ways that's very, of course, just because dismissive to Israel and Judaism. So there's a lot of red flags in the way some of this stuff is treated in modern times.
It's possible to be a strong supporter of the state of Israel, but not like Jews.
Yeah.
People do all kinds of things.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I never thought when we started this, it would take me this long to get through the first 5 books. But, I've really enjoyed it. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a little break, and we're going to do that Prince of Darkness book study on Monday nights at 8 during Lent. And then when Eastertide resumes, we'll resume as well with this class in the book of Joshua. So I'll send emails to the group that we have about the plan to resume after the Feast of Easter. And you're more than welcome to join us in trying to figure out where in the world we get all these weird ideas about the devil that we'll be doing during Lent. But thank you for being with me. This has been a lot of fun. And I hope to see many of you hopefully next week as we trade for a different study topic.
Okay.
All right. Good night.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.